Hello everyone. Today's lesson is going to focus on how molecules get across the cell membrane. Last class we focused on the structure of the cell membrane, and then in this class, we're going to discuss how molecules get across the membrane. If you look here, just to review our membrane structure briefly, we have our phospholipids here, and then we have our proteins. And remember, our phospholipids have a hydrophilic phosphate head, and then hydrophobic fatty acid tails. And the fatty acid tails here are in the middle, or kept in the middle of the bilayer to keep away from water. And then we have these proteins embedded in the membrane. In this lesson, one of the things we're going to discuss is the role of these proteins in letting molecules in and out of the cell. There are two types of transport. For the next week or so, we're going to be focusing on passive transport. Passive transport is when substances move from high to low concentration. I can spell concentration. And they use no energy to do so. Passive transport is when molecules move from low to high concentration. And to do this, they have to use energy in the form of what we learned in 9th grade, ATP. In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on the types of passive transport, diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. In the following weeks, after sort of a couple labs, we're going to be focusing on active transport and the two types of active transport. But this lesson focuses on passive transport, which is energy that moves materials from where there's a lot of them, from where there's a lot of them to where there's a little of them, and it doesn't require any energy to do so. So if you remember, the membrane is considered to be semi-permeable, meaning it only lets certain molecules through the membrane without help. If you remember, those molecules that can go in without help are molecules that are small in size, and also uncharged. And like the real word for uncharged, two real words for uncharged, which you should probably write down, are nonpolar or hydrophobic. When you learned this in 9th grade, you didn't use those terms, but things that can go through the membrane without help are things that are small and uncharged, and really what we mean by uncharged is either nonpolar or hydrophobic. Passive transport, again, like we just said, is movement across the membrane without energy, and we're going to discuss the three types: diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. So the first of our forms of passive transport is diffusion. And in diffusion is the process by which small and uncharged particles move across the membrane. And these go directly through the phospholipids. They don't use protein, phospholipids. I don't think I spelled that correctly, but you can spell it right. They go directly through the phospholipids, and they have to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So if we take a look at this image over here, if this is our semi-permeable membrane, there's a high concentration on this side and a low concentration on this side. And following the laws of diffusion, these molecules will diffuse in this direction, in the net direction. More will be diffusing that way than this way. Now, they will diffuse that way until the concentrations on both sides are equal. Okay? This is known as equilibrium. Okay? Now, at equilibrium, and this is important, at equilibrium, diffusion does not stop. At equilibrium, the rate of diffusion this way equals the rate of diffusion the other way. Okay? That is called equilibrium. Diffusion doesn't stop. It's just that the net diffusion is equal at that point. The net diffusion in, or the net diffusion to the left in this case, and the net diffusion to the right in this case is equal at equilibrium. Now I'm going to look at some examples of things that will need to go through the membrane or get in and out of the cell, and how they would go through. So our first type is we have these ions. Ions are charged particles, and they cannot enter the cell through simple diffusion. So these cannot go through just diffusion. We'll see how they go through in a second. Then we have molecules that are both polar. This is an example is glucose, and large, and we need glucose in the cell to do respiration. And since this is polar and also large, it can't enter the cell through simple diffusion. And then we have a third type of molecule is these molecules are polar, but they're small, water is an example, and urea is what we pee out. It's what our nitrogen waste products are made from. And these cannot go through the cell membrane through simple diffusion. And then last but not least, we have type 4, which are these are molecules that are nonpolar and also small. And here we have molecular oxygen, which obviously we need it in large quantities to do respiration. That can go in our cells through the membrane. And then we have carbon dioxide, which is also nonpolar and can go through the membrane. The other type of molecule that can go through the membrane through simple diffusion without help are lipids. And there are many hormones that are lipids that can go through the cell membrane without help, and that's going to be important later in the course. An example is estrogen. Estrogen is the female sex hormone. It's nonpolar, and it can diffuse through the membranes without help. And that's going to be important for a later lesson that we'll have. So, in conclusion, it's these molecules here that can go through the phospholipids without the help. And we'll talk about what the help is in a second. But these can just go through the phospholipid membrane. They're uncharged and small, and they do not need the help of, well, which we're going to talk to you about next, proteins to go through the membrane. So for the particles that are large or charged or polar or hydrophilic, they must enter through with the help of a protein. And this process is known as facilitated diffusion. It's the same thing as diffusion, as it has to move from high concentration to low concentration, but instead, it uses a protein. And these proteins, it's important to realize that they're specific proteins. Okay, it's not like there's some like massive protein that lets everything in. If you need to get water in, there's a specific protein called an aquaporin that lets water in. If you need to get sodium in, there's a sodium channel protein that lets sodium in. The proteins are specific for specific molecules, kind of like enzymes. But it's just like diffusion, except instead of going through the phospholipids here, because they get repelled by the fatty acid tails, these charged particles, they must get help with a protein. And these proteins are just like enzymes. They're specific, and the transport molecules fit in. The only difference is they're not catalyzing a reaction, they're letting things into or out of the cell. If you would like to watch the animation that's down here, feel free. It's a pretty good animation, and it sort of shows how the proteins work. So just to summarize, the proteins that do facilitated diffusion are very similar to enzymes in two cases. The first case is that they are specific for specific molecules. The second case is they kind of have a site where the molecule binds. So you should be writing these down. I can't find my pen, so I'm just going to say them. So number one, they're specific for specific molecules, and number two, they have a site, which is not called the active site, but they have a site for the transport molecules to bind. So for those two reasons, these proteins are very, very, very similar to enzymes in that they're specific, and that they have a site for the transport molecule to bind. They also actually slightly change shape when the transport molecule binds. To let it, and then let it in or out of the cell, depending upon whether it's going in or out. But they are very, very similar to enzymes. There are many diseases. One is cystic fibrosis, where if that protein is not working, it won't let certain things into and out of the cell, and that can lead to a disease. I'm going to stop this video now and upload it, so we can do the second portion of this video, which is sort of the second half of this PowerPoint slide, which is about osmosis. So at this point, what I would do is I would start answering the guided questions that you can answer so far. I'll be back.